Microsoft Dynamics 365 provides many features organizations can use to manage the services they provide to the customers. In this module, we'll discuss service level agreements and how they can be used along with other record types to accommodate service management functions. In this module, the objectives are to create and manage service level agreements, to define the types of service level agreements and analyze the difference between them, to explore service level agreement actions and details, and finally, to manage cases that are associated with service level agreements. SLA stands for Service Level Agreement. Service level agreements are a way of tracking and defining what should happen when a case is opened. It's an agreement between a vendor and a client that establishes an expectation of timing of services that are provided by the vendor. These expected levels of response can involve when the client can expect the initial response to a question, problem, or request, or even when they expect an issue to be resolved. They are used to not only set the expectation with the client, but serve as a key performance indicator for the vendor. Within Dynamics 365, these key performance indicators, or KPIs, can be established and the definition of what success or failure means in a particular context. Users can define actions when KPIs are not met or are close to violations. With the definitions of success, failure, and even when a warning should be sent to the service provider, the actions that need to be taken at each of these points can be established. For example, if you are within 5 minutes of nearing non-compliance, an email can be automatically sent to the case owner, or perhaps the case can be escalated to a different person or queue. Not only can you create SLAs for cases, but you can also create them for any other custom or system entity. Let's take a look at some examples. In the example, we have a typical SLA. And we have two different types of customers, premium corporate customers and standard customers. And based upon the KPIs we establish, we state that if a case priority is high, we guarantee a response within 1 hour, within 1 business hour, and a resolution within 1 business day. Additionally, for the same customer type, if the case priority is not high, then we guarantee a response time within 4 business hours and a resolution time within 2 business days. Now, for all other customers, regardless of the case priority, if they are not a premium corporate customer, we guarantee the first response within 1 business day and the case resolution within 5 business days. So let's take a look at a scenario. First, we start with the case being created. We've established that one of the KPIs we want to review is the first response by field. And the second kind of KPI that we're looking at is the case resolved by field. So essentially, once the KPIs are determined, we can define certain warnings. Now, for the first response, if we are within 30 minutes of nearing compliance, we can send a warning email or maybe create another record type which documents that we're about to reach non-compliance. The same thing can be done essentially for any KPIs. Additionally, once we have failed or we actually are past the point of compliance, we can take other actions. For example, perhaps sending an email to the customer service representative as well as their manager and update the case's SLA met value is equal to no. Now, these are some really basic examples. It's important to note that as an organization, you have a great deal of flexibility to indicate what does success mean in this context and what is failure, as well as what constitutes a warning, and what should we do about any of these scenarios. We know that in Microsoft Dynamics 365, SLAs define the level of service or support that your organization agrees to offer to customers. They also include detailed items to define metrics or key performance indicators, KPIs, to attend that service level. Essentially, KPIs help you get a timely warning on your team's issue while providing support. Within Microsoft Dynamics 365, you can create two different types of SLAs: standard SLA and enhanced. They are both similar except for the fact that enhanced SLAs have additional capabilities that the standard SLAs don't have. Now, even though it's possible to have both types of SLAs in the system, it is recommended to only use one type and to not mix and match for consistency and ongoing management. Now, also, if you have not used SLAs to date, it is strongly recommended to use only enhanced SLAs over standard SLAs. In the next two lessons, we'll dive deeper into what each SLA type consists of and the difference between them. The first type of SLA we'll talk about is the standard SLA. Now, before creating any type of SLA, it's important to note that the ability to create them is dependent on your security role. So before creating an SLA, verify that you have the appropriate security role or permissions to create them. Another important note is that when you activate an SLA, a corresponding workflow is also created. When creating a standard SLA, you add SLA details to define the key performance indicators, KPIs, or metrics for the service level agreement. That said, you can define any KPI as per your organization's requirements. For example, a KPI could be where all cases for standard customers must be resolved within 5 days of the case creation. So when designing standard SLAs, it's important to define not only the success criteria, but also what happens if we fail. What is failure? What constitutes a warning? What do we do if we hit that warning stage? For example, if you select 1 hour, the KPI will be considered as failed if the first response is not done within 1 hour of the case creation. 1 hour is calculated based on the value in the date-time field selected within the SLA record. The time for failure and warning is calculated after considering the business hours selected in the SLA record. If a specific schedule is not selected, the work hours are considered 24/7. Another element that is important to mention as a key differentiator between standard and enhanced SLAs is the fact that standard SLAs requires additional form customizations for users to be able to take advantage of those SLA details. In the upcoming demonstration, we'll see what some of those customizations are, as well as how we'll go about configuring and using standard SLAs. Okay. So before we actually go in and take a look at the standard SLAs, one of the things that's important to know, as we mentioned earlier, that to be able to really see how the SLA KPIs work, it's actually necessary to customize the case form. So you'll see that I actually have the actual case form open within our customization window. Now, it needs to be emphasized that, this course is not about how to go in and how to customize the form, but just to get a better understanding about how the standard SLAs work, we want to be able to pull in some key information regarding the tracking of the SLA KPIs. So a couple of things to look at is that by default, you do actually have a section called Applicable SLAs already on the case form, where you have the first response by and the resolve by fields. But one of the things I've actually done is I've actually pulled the first response sent field. Now that's a little bit further down on the case originally, but I went ahead and added it here as well, just so that we could see what happens when we actually go through and we change that value. The other thing that I also added was a couple other fields. 2 of these fields are actually timer fields. So it allows us to be able to go through and really see how an SLA works by actually going through and counting down the actual time based on when these different KPIs are actually changed. Now, again, for standard SLAs, we're actually doing this instead of automating it, which of course it can be automated through workflows. I went ahead and added the SLA field onto the case form so that we can manually assign a service level agreement so that, again, we can see what happens when we actually have a service level associated to a case. Now, a couple of things to take a look at, and as I mentioned, I've actually put 2 timers on this case form. In looking at the timers, again, this is where we're evaluating when we actually have a success scenario, when we actually might have a warning scenario, and some of the other situations. So basically, I have a timer more or less saying that when the failure time field needs to be looked at is when is the first response by. It is considered successful when the field called first response is sent is equal to yes. Now you'll notice I don't have a failure condition, but I do basically say set up a warning condition when my status is close to nearing compliance. And then I can also have as far as a cancel condition or a pause condition. And then the same thing as far as my resolve date and looking at the timer for the resolve by date, this is now where, again, when it meets the compliancy is when the status is equal to resolved. When it is failured, I'm using another KPI, which is my resolve by SLA status as reaching non-compliant. And then I can also have my warnings in there, saying when it's near compliance, and then again, what happens when a case is canceled or when a case is put on hold. So now again, in this scenario, once we actually go through and we customize the form, typically what we would do is we would save it and then we'd publish it. Now, for the brevity of this, that's something that we've already done in this environment. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go back into our system. All right, so now to be able to walk through as far as what it would look like when we actually have the SLAs turned on, I'm going to go ahead and create a new case. Okay, so let's say I'm going to do this for our fourth copy. Okay, and then my contact, Siobhan. And on this one, we're going to actually have this, and let's say that we're going to set the priority to being a high priority. Okay. Now, once we have that, again, to be able to show as far as how this SLA is going to work, this is where I'm going to go ahead and manually assign the SLA that we want to use for this particular case. Now, again, typically this is something that we can automate using a workflow or business process to be able to do this behind the scenes. But again, for this example, we're going to go ahead and we're going to select our high priority standard SLA that's out there. Now, as soon as I go through and I actually assign that SLA and I actually save this record, as soon as I go through and I save the case, one of the things that you'll see is that within now that SLA section is it's now going to start going through and it's going to start counting down the time as to when the first response should be sent and then also when the resolve by due date should be sent. So what will happen as far as it's going through and it's going through and it's actually doing the countdown, this is where as it gets closer to the non-compliance, we can actually see a warning that will go off, and then the same thing that as far as with the resolve by due date, it will also go through and configure it as necessary. So one of the things I can do is I'm going through and I'm actually working this case, is once I'm done working this case itself, I can go through, and as soon as I change to where the first response is sent, you'll notice that it actually now measures that SLA KPI compliance as being succeeded. Now, to be able to understand as far as how it's measuring this, what is considered to be successful and was not be able to successful, that's where we can go through and we can actually take a look at the SLA itself. So I'm just going to drill back to my SLA record directly from the case. All right, so we're back in the application, and before we actually go through and we talk about the SLAs a little bit more, one of the things I want to do is just to show you when we're in our standard case form. So if we go in, I'm just going to open up one of our existing cases, and as we go through and we open up the existing case, by default, you'll see that when I scroll down that there are a couple of fields that are automatically available on our standard case form, and that is the first respond by and the resolve by. But in order to be able to see how a standard SLA can be able to track the KPIs for that SLA, this is where we're actually going to go through, and as we talked about, that there's a little customization that's going to be necessary. So what I've already done is we're actually in the case form customization window, and again, this is not a lesson as far as how to go in and how to do a customization, but to kind of show you and get a better understanding as far as how these timers work and how the SLA works, we've actually gone through and I've done some customizations on this. So as I've mentioned, the first respond by and the resolve by fields are already added on the form by default. But then I've also added, or I've actually moved as far as where the first response field is going to be shown. So again, we can easily see how, when those KPIs are measured, what happens when this field is changed. Now, the other thing I also did was I added the SLA field on here. Again, by default, this is not a field that's available. And so to be able to go in and see what happens, we need to make sure that we have a case associated to an SLA. Now, the other two things that I've done is actually added a couple of timer fields so that, again, it can track as far as when it's actually hit a warning violation or when it's hit a failure violation of not being able to meet that service level agreement. So in taking a look at the actual timer control, you'll see that I've actually just given a label. And what I'm doing is I'm more or less saying, what field do I want to trigger a failure time on? And so you'll see that I actually have it as far as on my first respond by field. And then basically the question is, well, what equals a success? And the success would be that when the first response sent is equal to yes. And then from there, what happens when I actually need a warning? What happens as far as canceling it and pausing it? And then you'll see that I've done the same thing with the resolve by. So very, very similar. The only thing that's different between the two of them is the failure time field that I'm looking at is now the resolve by field. And again, I've done the same thing. The success is where the status, the case status is equal to resolved. And then again, the countdown as far as what's going to be compliant or even nearing compliant is it will actually start the countdown process. Okay? So again, the process of this is not to necessarily walk through how to do the customization. It's basically out of the scope of the actual course itself, but just to kind of show you and get a better idea about how this will work. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and go back into my application. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new case. We're going to do this for our fourth coffee customer. Our contact is Yvonne. Case title, printer will not print. And then again, what we're triggering off of is that whenever we actually have, as far as with the SLAs, when the priority is high, is when we want that SLA to be enabled. So I'm going to change my priority to high. I'm going to actually set this origin. Let's say we'll set that to email. And then of course our description is the printer will not print and jobs are stuck in the queue. Okay, so once I actually have that set up, I'm going to actually scroll down and we'll actually take a look at our new customized form. So now that we've changed that, we're going to have to go through and reconfigure. Okay. Now again, as I scroll down, you'll see that I actually have these customized fields that are in there. Now up to this point, it is basically just treating this as any other case. But now if I come down to the SLA form, and again, in this scenario, in this particular demonstration, it is simply that we're going to manually add the SLA. Now this can be automated using workflows or different processes that would be able to do this behind the scene. But in our situation, I am actually just going to go in and manually apply it. So you'll see I've got an existing SLA out there called High Priority Standard SLA. Once I go in, I select it, and then I actually save the case. Once the case saves, and I scroll back down, you'll now see that the timers have started. So immediately, it's going through and it's actually looking at, based on what we said as far as the time of what's considered to be failure, what's considered to be success, and how much time the first response has to be sent by and when it needs to be resolved by. Now, while that's doing it, just to kind of give you an idea about how that was set up, I'm going to go ahead and drill back down to be able to look at that SLA. So within here, you'll see that this is our standard SLA form. Again, I can give it a name. You'll notice on the entity, I'm telling it what entity I want to track it against. And then on the applicable from, I'm also telling it when do I want to start when do I want to actually start tracking that SLA. You'll also see the standard type, or the SLA type, is set to standard. And then again, I've given it some descriptions. Now, more importantly, as I scroll down, you'll also see that this is where now I have my SLA details. This is where I've designated when do I want to actually be warned that we're about to be non-compliant on our service level agreement, and when is it going to be considered failure. And in taking a look at that, you'll notice I have one for my first response and one for when it should be resolved. So I'm going through and actually looking at the actual details behind what's considered failures and what's considered successful. This is again where you'll see that I can actually have the name, and then this is now where I actually have what that KPI should be measured by. What case field am I measuring? And that is going to be that first respond by field. And then also under the applicable when, this is the scenarios of when should this SLA be applied. Now again, for this demo, you'll see that we've kept it very simple in saying that we're only going to apply SLAs, or service level agreements, when the priority is set to high. And then from here, the question is when we actually have that. So if we actually create a case and the priority is set to normal, we're not going to have any service level agreements being applied against that case. But then the question is, what's considered successful? What is considered that, yes, we've met that KPI measurement? And again, on this one, it's met when the first response is equal to yes. And then the question is, when do we actually want to tell it that we have a failure? So how much time do we actually want to have it before it's considered a failure? Now again, for our demo purposes, you'll notice I kept it very short. Failure after 2 minutes, warn after a minute. Now this is also where we can go through, and in a real life scenario, we're probably going to give a little bit more time before we actually allow our support agents to be able to go through and respond, and not only that, to be able to go in to complete it. But now that we've looked at that, let's go back and actually look at our actual case and what's going on with the case. So now, as I scroll down, you'll notice that as I'm going through this, that timer has already acknowledged that I have actually exceeded, or I have failed on being able to meet that KPI measurement, in that I have not responded within the last 2 minutes. Not only that, but I'm 3 minutes and 23 seconds and counting, failed past what I should have been able to do. Now, at the same time, notice that if I'm from here, as soon as I go through and I actually meet that measurement, it now says, okay, it's been completed. And then if I also wanted to, again, when we actually talked about the resolve by date, it would actually go through and again give a non-compliant warning. And one of the things that you can see, and I took a little too long talking about the SLA to show you, but you notice that as soon as it hit the failure, that it changed the counter itself and showed that we've actually violated now what we had on that timer. As we get closer, and we're not going to wait 2 minutes to be able to get down to the resolve by to actually show, but when we start hitting warnings, it actually changes to a yellow color, or more of an orangish color, to let you know that you're getting close to your non-compliancy. Now again, in this case, as soon as I go through, I tell it that I've resolved the case. So we have it where the problem's solved. I give it some time that it took to actually go through and resolve that minute. I click resolve. Let's see if we can do that again. Okay, so once I go through and I click resolve, you'd also see that the resolve by due would also be changed to succeeded. Now, if I don't resolve this case, just like what we saw with the first respond by, it would continue to count down until this particular case has been resolved. So you'll see that when it comes to the standard SLAs, that there's some manual process that's necessary to be able to get this to work. So the difference between a standard SLA and an enhanced SLA is with enhanced SLAs, this is all automated and it's all streamlined to where we don't have to do any customizations or worry about as far as going through and assigning the SLAs themselves. As we've briefly mentioned, enhanced SLAs have some additional capabilities that the standard SLAs don't have. With an enhanced SLA, you can pause an SLA when the case is on hold, so that the time the case is on hold isn't considered in the SLA calculations. You can also add success actions to an SLA. For example, you may want to send communications internally or even externally when the SLA has succeeded. Success actions are initiated only when the success condition is met on time, not when it's breached. By default, we also have the ability to track SLA statuses and times directly from the case form without any customizations. Now, these details are tracked through the SLA KPI instant record type. Again, we've already mentioned, even though there are two types of SLAs available, Microsoft suggests using only one type of SLA in your organization to stay consistent. That said, since enhanced SLAs are more feature-rich than the standard SLAs, it's recommended to use enhanced SLAs going forward. When creating SLAs, adding SLA details are what define the key performance indicators, or KPIs, or metrics. For the service level agreement, you can define any KPI as per your organization's requirements. For example, one KPI could be all cases for standard customers must be resolved within 5 days of case creation. So we'd want to be able to measure where the customer is defined as the standard customer. Then we could define the criteria of the failure warning actions to be taken when a case has passed its defined met term. SLA KPIs are performance indicators that you'd like to track, for example, first response or resolve by. As mentioned, SLA items refer to SLA KPIs based on specific conditions, and you can add multiple SLA items and arrange them in order that works for you. Now, keep in mind, for any given KPI, only the first SLA item that matches the conditions in the applicable when section is applied. Within the service module, both SLA and SLA details use the process workflow functionality. Now, even though SLA KPIs use workflows, the actions available for defining the failure and warning actions only include the following action types: sent email, create record, update record, and change status. There are also other actions that can be taken on the actual SLA itself. For the SLA itself, it's possible to set the SLA as default. This is helpful when you want to apply it to all the cases that don't have an SLA specifically applied to it through the entitlement. With that said, you cannot apply an SLA to a case unless it's set as the default, or if it's associated with an entitlement. Also, you can only have one default SLA at a time. Additionally, you can disable SLAs for the organization. For example, you might want to disable the SLA during certain maintenance activities, or maybe when you're importing cases and don't want the SLA to be applied to all those specific cases. So, for now, let's take a look at how enhanced SLAs are different from standard SLAs. All right, so back in Dynamics 365, we're actually going to go through to be able to create SLAs, as we kind of look through as far as when we did the standard SLAs. It's actually not done under the actual service dropdown where we actually have our cases and queues, but it's actually done under settings. And then from settings, we're going to go to our service management area. Now, in the service management area, you'll notice that kind of halfway down the field, this is where we actually have our service terms. And so with the service terms, this is where, to be able to go in and create in either standard or enhanced SLAs, is where we're going to go to service level agreements. So once we go into our service level agreements, again, you'll see that we actually have the one that we talked about with the standard SLAs, that we actually have that one already in the list. Now, I am actually going to, for demonstration purposes, right now this is set to active, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to deactivate this one. As we talked about, again, very similar to some of the other functionalities within Dynamics 365, that you have to be able to go in and activate certain functionalities and deactivate certain functionalities to be able to go through and edit them, make revisions to them, or actually make sure that they're going to be triggered. So once we go through and we're going to deactivate this, we'll walk through the steps of creating a new enhanced SLA. Now, with this new enhanced SLA, let's say that we want to be able to have a standard SLA that's going to be covered for all of our cases. So we have company policy that we want to be able to have service level agreements for all of our customers, and that every case that comes in should be abided under our service level agreements. So in this one, I'm actually going to call this one default SLA for all customers. Okay, and then of course on the entity, I'm actually going to select a case and then select OK. So from here, again, you'll see that now in setting up this SLA or the enhanced SLA, that I can actually give it a name. Again, I can select the entity, and then on the applicable from, this is where you'll see that I can actually choose, again, what is or when does this SLA should be applied? When should we actually start tracking and measuring these KPIs? So again, it might be something that we could do it on the created on the modified on, or on the follow-up by. So for us, we're actually going to do it on the created on. Now, the other thing that you'll also notice is that we have business hours. Now, what this can do is that, if we think about this, that we actually have customers on the East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, that we might want to be able to actually have different SLAs depending on what part of the country those customers are in. So we can actually set up both business hours as well as holiday hours to be applied, saying we're not in violation if we actually, we receive an SLA or we receive a case that comes in at 7 p.m. and, from Texas versus something that comes in at 5 p.m. in Los Angeles. So again, going through and actually setting up those business hours, it's outside the scope of this course, but it is something to where if there are any existing business hours or holiday hours that we have out there, we can actually apply it to the actual SLAs. Now you'll also notice as far as under the SLA type, is it defaults to enhanced, but this is also where, again, should you want to be able to use a standard one, this is where you can actually select the type that you want. As I mentioned though, the default setting that you have on this is enhanced. Now, the other thing that you can also do is allow pause and resume. So again, if there's a reason that we have to put that case on hold for some reason, we're waiting for the customer to get back from us, we're waiting for a third-party provider to be able to follow up with us on that information, is that, again, we have the ability to actually pause and resume our service agreement KPI monitoring. All right, so now once we actually have our basic information, and again, if we want to give it a description so that anyone else that looks at this, we can actually put in here a description. Now, again, you'll see that we actually have our SLA details, but you'll notice as far as with our details, we don't have that plus sign to be able to create any additional details yet. Again, this is very much like other records that we have within the system, that before we can add details, we have to save the main header record first. Now, you'll notice as soon as I do save it, this is where I can now go to my SLA details and I can now create what I want to be able to monitor on. And again, that's very similar to what we had as far as our standard SLA, is that we have two different criteria that we want to be able to track. When our customer agents actually go through and first respond to a case, and then when that case has been resolved. So in this scenario, I'm going to actually create two different detail types of tracking that I want to be able to monitor. The first one is going to be our resolve by, and then the second one is going to be our resolve by, our first respond by, and then our second one's going to be our resolve by. So in this one, it's very similar to what we saw as far as with our standard SLA, that we want to be able to give it a name. So we'll have this one as being our first response by. And then this is also where we can tell it what KPIs do we want to be able to go out there and do we want to measure against. So you'll see that you actually have the two standard ones out there. When are we first responding to the customer, and when have we actually resolved the case for the customer? So obviously in this one we're going to actually go in and select, because we are going to be monitoring as far as our first response, we're going to use our first response KPI. Now, in the applicable when, in our standard scenario, we actually did it when only we had high priority cases. But in this scenario, we want to be able to manage it and monitor it against any cases that come into the system, regardless who the customer is. We have a standard policy that all cases have a standard service level agreement against them. So in that case, we don't necessarily want to have any kind of criteria to monitor it against. We want it to be for all cases. So we're going to leave this wide open and not have it look at any additional criteria. What we do want to do, though, is say, okay, when is it considered successful? So this is again where I can actually set up saying, when is this KPI considered to be met? So again, this is where I can say that I can actually have on here where first response sent is equal to yes. All right. Now, once I have that, again, very similar to the main form, once we have that configured, you'll notice that I can go through and I also say, okay, when is it considered a failure, and when should we start warning that we've not met those conditions? So from here, again, for demo purposes, we're going to actually make that a little bit smaller, and we're going to say it's going to be considered a failure, again, after 2 minutes, and it's going to warn us after 1 minute. Now, the other thing that we can also do, and again, this is where it's a little bit different between a standard SLA and enhanced SLA, is this is where we want to tell it that when we have a failure, do we want certain actions to be performed? When we're getting close to hitting non-compliance, do we want to have certain actions to be taken? So let's say in this scenario that when there is a failure, we want two things to happen. When we've actually not hit this compliancy, when we've violated this 2-minute mark that we have and we have not responded back to that client, we want it to do two things. The first thing we want it to do is we want to actually take that case and we want to send it to our escalation queue. The second thing that we want to do is, let's say that we want to actually send an email to our actual case owner's manager to let them know we actually have a case that has actually violated our service level agreements. So you'll notice again, right here, I can't do anything yet to be able to go in and set up any kind of actions. But very similar to our main form, the minute I actually save the item, so you see, once I save the item, from here, I now actually have different actions that I can take. So not only can I actually do it as far as off of failures, but I can even do it off of success steps. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail when we talk about our resolutions. But again, in this case, I do want to set up steps that if we have a failure on this, I want to do two things. So from here, I can actually go in and I'm going to tell it to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it that I want to create a record. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail when we get into queue management. But what I actually want to tell it to do is I want to tell it to create a queue item. And what this is going to do is this is where it's going to actually go through and put an item in our escalation queue. So now that I'm telling it to create that record, this is where I can click on Set Properties, and I can now populate what information is going to be inside of that record. So in this scenario, I can actually just go through and I can specify what queue I want to send it to. And from here, again, as far as going through and looking at this, you'll see that we actually already have a queue existing called Escalated Cases. And then basically, in my queue item, I more or less just want to give it the information that I actually have from the original case. So using the dynamic values in my form assistant over here, I can basically just tell it, make the same name that we actually have as far as in my case to be the same thing as my queue item. So you'll notice it automatically populated that. So I'm going to tell it that that is the information I want to add. But again, to be able to add that value into this field, I want to click the OK button. Okay, now once I've done, that's basically all I need to do. I just basically tell it that I want to be able to create that record. And now what will happen is when it reaches a violation, it will now move that item or that particular case into that queue so that now our escalation support team can go in and start working on that case to make sure that we get that resolution completed. Like I said though, not only do I want to actually go in and move it to a queue, but the other thing I want to do is I want to be able to send an email. So again, you're not limited to just one action that you can have as far as on your SLAs. You can have as many actions as necessary for your organization to be able to meet what they have within their service level agreements. So in this scenario, you can see that I actually told it to go ahead and we're going to send an email. And again, as far as sending an email, I actually have two options. I can manually create a new message, or if there's an existing template out there, I can actually go through and be able to create a template as necessary off of my email templates. Again, for our scenario, we're going to go ahead and just create a manual message. So from here, I'm going to click on Set Properties. And so you'll notice, if you've worked with as far as the email templates, you'll notice it's very similar to most of our email forms that we've worked with. Now, as far as the from field, we want to be able to go through and specify, okay, who is this coming from? Who are we sending this to? So let's say in my from field, it might be that, again, in looking at this, I want to send it from whoever created that case. But you also notice that, again, from here, I can also go through and say, not only is it by the created by user, but I can also be it as being the owning users. In other words, who currently owns that case. So I might say that I want it to be as far as my owning case. So I can add it in there. And now, again, what I want to do is I want to send it to that owner's manager. So you'll notice that when I click on that drop-down arrow for the look to, I'm not just limited to doing it off the case, but any related entities from that case, I can also go in and I can choose. So you'll notice as I scroll through that we actually have as far as my customer information, my contact information, entitlements that might be out there. But also, as I scroll down, you'll notice that I've got owning team and I've got owning user. So when I select owning user, again, I click on that drop-down arrow. And then this is where you'll see that as part of that, one of the fields I have as an option is to be able to send it to their manager. So again, if we actually have them designated as far as the users and who their managers are, I can select that. And again, in my to field, I can go ahead and click in to say this is who I want to send it to. I can even, from that subject, let's say that I want to be able to go in and let's say back to the case, I want to be able to go in and say that whether the activities are completed, or let's say I want to have it where it's going to have the case title and let's say that I also have my first response by KPI. Or let's say that as far as looking at this, I can actually have the first response by KPI status. So I can actually have multiple fields. They're going to be actually populated. And you'll notice that as I add them in there, it doesn't remove the one that was already used. So if I actually had them both selected and I clicked OK, they would both be added in that subject field. But I'm going to go ahead and select that one, click OK. So again, you'll now see that it's going to populate that. Now, if I wanted to, again, we can personalize this and I can have the manager's name in here, but I can more or less just say on this one, and again, using this, I can say the following case and then put the case title in there. And then again, I can populate this as far as using the fields and the information that I want to be able to include on these fields as to what SLAs that I want to be able to go in and track. So I can add that. So I can add that to the field. And then once that is actually added, there we go. Once that's added, you'll even notice in the regarding, it actually pulls the case information in there. And then again, there's additional fields that I can even include when I'm actually sending this out. So I can actually pull some of this information over directly from that case. In our scenario though, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just leave it pretty basic for that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save and close that one. So again, on the failures, we actually have two different steps. Now, I could do the same thing as far as if I want warning actions. So again, with the warning actions, I might want to actually send an email to the actual owner of the case, letting them know that they might be close to violating the SLA. Again, for brevity's sake, we're going to go ahead and we're going to simplify this. We're going to go ahead and just choose Save and Close. So again, we'll see that we actually have one set up for a first response. We're going to do the same thing now for our case resolution. So on this one, again, we're just going to call this one case resolution. And then we want to make sure, and this is an easy one to overlook, we want to make sure that we change the SLA KPI to being resolved by KPI. In other words, when is it being resolved? Just like before, the applicable when, we want to do it against all cases. So I'm going to leave that wide open and I'm not going to set up any criteria. But what I am going to do is, again, the question is, what's considered the success? When is this KPI considered to be met? And in this scenario, we want to be able to do it where what's successful is when our case status is considered to equal as resolved. Now, once it's resolved, again, I can actually go through and I can designate as to what is considered to be failure. And again, we're going to scale this down to 7 minutes. And you'll see that it just kind of in looking at this drop-down field, a couple of things you'll notice. You'll notice that I can manually go in and I can type in any time that I want to. But if you actually scroll through, you'll notice that you actually have quite a different array of selections that you can choose as well. So you're not limited to, but if you actually have different ones than, let's say, more than 3 days or 5 days, you can always go in and you can overwrite what those default settings are. And then let's also say as far as we're going to warn after, and in this case, we're going to warn after 5 minutes. Now, again, I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we're not going to go through and we're not going to go through the exercise of doing it, but let's say in a standard scenario that once we actually have that case being set as resolved, I want to go ahead and send an email to the customer to let them know we've shown that your case has now been resolved. So again, this might be an example where I would actually have success actions, and I would do a send email step. And on this particular one, and again, this would be a great example where you might want to actually use a template for our cases, and then from here you can actually then go in and have a nice email being set out, and you'll notice that it will actually then allow you to choose an existing template that you have in a list. Now, of course, we don't have one for cases for this particular scenario, but it's very similar to what we just walked through before. So again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually close out of there. And just to make sure this is going to run, I'm going to go ahead and just delete this step. All right. So now that we've actually have both of what to do as far as making sure our service level agreement is going to be met for when we first respond to the customer, as well as when the case is being resolved, we've actually completed as far as this standard SLA. Now, what's important though is once we have our SLA set up, and we kind of talked about it at the very beginning of the actual demonstration, for this to be able to be starting to run and to be evaluated for any new cases that come in, we want to make sure that we activate it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on the Activate button, and we're going to go ahead and click on Activate. So once this becomes activated, any new case that comes in, whether it's manually inserted, whether it's imported in some way or another, it'll now start monitoring and have this asynchronous workflow in the background and evaluating as far as when we're actually doing the first response to the customers and when we're actually going through and resolving the actual customer's support issues. Now, the other thing that we can also do is you'll see that up here is if I tell this to set it as the default, this will now be that if there's no other SLA that is assigned at the account record or the contact record, this will now be considered the default for all customers that we have in the system. So then from here, I'm going to go ahead and when I close out of that SLA, just to kind of show you, which again, as a reminder, you can have as many SLA agreements or service level agreements as you need to. So you might have one that's going to be for our premium customers, one for our standard customers, and maybe another one for our retail customers. It just depends. But as a reminder, you'll even notice that in our actual service agreement view that we have, right from here, you'll see that I can see the entity it's tracked against, whether it's been set as being active, and whether or not it's being set as being default. So once we actually have that set up, now all cases that come in will now be looking at to see if we are meeting the expectations that we have set with our customers to be able to go through and actually address their customer issues very quickly and promptly. Another aspect of working with SLAs is that sometimes you may need to manually apply SLAs to a case record. Now, why might you do this? It's possible where situations occur where, depending on the nature of the customer or the situation, you might want to engage the SLA for the client. It's also possible to have the ability to apply SLAs automatically to the cases based on business logic, whether using workflows or other plugins. For example, if your customers are spread across geographies, you may want multiple SLAs with different business hours and holiday schedules. It is possible to set up business logic to apply SLAs on case records based on a customer's region to ensure the SLA time calculation happens based on the correct geography. Now that we've learned about SLAs, the types of SLAs, and SLA detail and actions, we can explore how service level agreements work with and are managed from cases. First, how is the SLA applied? When a case is created, the SLA is applied either by default or through an entitlement, and the related case field values are updated. Now, when a case is modified and any of the case field values change, such as when the fields in the applicable when conditions of the SLA change, the SLA is applied again. For example, if the priority of the case changes from normal to high, and according to the SLA, the first response should happen soon, the SLA is reapplied to make sure that the KPIs are tracked based upon the updated values. Additionally, when the SLA is applied again, all of the SLA items are evaluated based upon the updated case fields, and the failure or warning actions are initiated if the time has exceeded. This happens even if the failure or warning actions were already initiated before the case was updated. So how might this be different between a standard and an enhanced SLA? Well, the following list explains the process when a standard or enhanced SLA is applied to a case form. First, when working with a standard SLA, only the failure time is tracked and saved on a case record. Also, you can request the system administrator or customizer to add a timer to the case form. The timer shows the time remaining to meet the SLA or the time elapsed since the SLA failed. Now, with the enhanced SLAs, as we've talked about, there's a lot of additional features here. For example, a related KPI record is created for each SLA KPI that is tracked and tied directly to that case. Additionally, there's a timer and the KPI instances for the case with their statuses and failure and warning times. In other words, customizers and system administrators don't need to add that as they would with the standard SLA. Also, cases can be put on hold and the status of the SLA KPI instance is set to paused. You can see the time for which a case was on hold and the last time the case was put on hold. Now, when the service agent resumes the case, assuming it was on hold, the status of the SLA KPI instance record is updated and the following details are updated, such as failure time, warning time, and total time the case is on hold. Now that we see that sorry, let's back it up a little bit because again, I did something, I don't know what I'm doing with the mouse, but it adjusted the slide and it went back. So let's go to, that last bullet point when a case, there we go. Now, when the service agent resumes a case, assuming it was on hold, the status of the SLA KPI instance record is updated and the following details are updated, such as failure time, warning time, and the total time the case is on hold. Now, let's see how we can work with these SLAs now that we've defined what they are, how they're configured, and so on. All right, so now that we've actually set up our enhanced SLA, the question is, how do we actually now apply them to the cases? Well, if you remember, as far as with setting up that enhanced SLA, we actually established to where it's going to be monitoring against all cases, and because we set it as being the default, it'll automatically be able to be set up against any new case for any new customer that, or for any customer that is actually in the system. So what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to create a case using our quick create functionality. Our customer, let's say that this is going to be for our Contoso Pharmaceuticals. For this one, it's going to be our 3D printer. Needs calibrating. Case type, let's say that we have this as being a request. We'll set up as far as our contact. Maybe. Okay. Origin, and then again, if we wanted to fill out any other information in here, and again, we can set up the description. In this case, we actually have it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save our record. All right. Now that we've saved the record, we're going to actually take a look at as far as the case itself. So I'm going to go in and click on View Record. All right. Now that we're actually within the case itself, one of the things I'm actually going to do is go back to our regular case form. So we go through and actually look at what our normal case looks like when we actually have the enhanced SLAs enabled. So from here, again, we're back to our normal case form. And in looking at this, as a reminder, like one of the things that you'll see as far as with our actual case form itself, when we have our tab selector, there's actually a section down there for enhanced SLAs. So when I click on that, you'll now see that automatically two things have appeared, very similar to what we looked about with our standard SLAs, except now you'll see that it's automatically going out and it's tracking that information. Not only is it tracking that information, but it's already telling me that I'm about 5 seconds away from violating my first response KPI. And you'll notice that it's already even gone in and is giving me as far as when I've actually hit my warning time and when I've hit my failure time. So that it's now being tracked automatically, and I can now use those for deeper analysis and business intelligence as to how long are we actually taking to be able to respond to our customers and to be able to resolve their issues. So as it's going through, you'll notice, if you'll remember, one of the things that we told it to do is that when we have a failure, there's two things we wanted it to do. And so one of the things that you'll also notice is that as it's going through, not only that, but the actual statuses you will see automatically refresh as well. But as I mentioned, one of the things that we told it to do was when we have a violation, we wanted to do two things. And those two things that we wanted to do is we wanted to create an added queue, or add it to our escalated queue, and then also create an email activity. So one of the things we can do is we go back under our services, we go to our queues, and from our in our escalated cases, you'll now see that it actually moved that case into that queue. And then again, what it should have also done is it should have triggered as far as an email. Now, in this situation that, as far as the email configurations may or may not have been set up, but this very similar to some of the other functionalities, if I want to see as far as what's going on with that, that's also where I can go under my settings, go under my system jobs, and to be able to see as far as what was going on as far as going through and sending it out. So you'll notice as far as when I look at this, I can go through and see as to what the status is with that particular SLA agreement and any actions that we had working against it. So that by default, when we actually have our SLAs that are set up, you'll see that once we have that information out there, it is automatically doing all of this tracking that we did where we manually had to set that up as far as with our standard SLAs, which goes back to why it's recommended that if you are not using SLAs first, the recommended process is to be able to use our enhanced SLAs so that we can track that information so that, again, our touch point that we actually have as far as with our customers, we can make sure that we are able to succeed with them in being able to address their issues in a timely manner. Now, you'll also notice that, let's say I want to go through and let's see what happens when I resolve this case. And again, we mark this as being resolved. So you'll notice, in fact, a couple things that you'll see from here. There is that email that was sent. Because again, it goes back, it's part of that asynchronous workflow, so it gets fired off. So we now actually have the email that was sent, letting you know that it violated and the actual information that we have to have out there as far as there's our email. And then more importantly, now that we actually have this resolved, you'll notice that in looking at this, we actually have that it shows us being succeeded and when it was succeeded on. So again, this is great information that we can use for our business intelligence to make sure that we have the ability to address our customers' issues on a quickly and efficient manner with using our enhanced SLAs. In this module, we discussed service level agreements. We talked about standard SLAs and even enhanced SLAs. We also talked about the purpose of SLAs. Now, these SLAs can be used to track the amount of time that passes before a case is taken by a support engineer. In other words, what's the response time or what's the resolution time? Then, based upon what happens with the case and how it's handled or not handled, you can even send out emails when the time is near expiration, or you can actually reach the point of failure based upon the rules that you've set up. In this module, the objectives were to create and manage service level agreements, to define the types of service level agreements and analyze the differences between them, to explore the service level agreement's actions and details, to manage cases that are associated with service level agreements,